Hello and welcome to the fourth of our series of talks and discussions about the 5 principles of the middle way. So far I've been talking about skepticism. We've had 2 sessions on skepticism. We've had a general introductory session on the 5 principles of the middle way, all of which are geared towards thinking about how we actually practice the middle way, what's involved in that practice. If we try and think about things from a middle way perspective, what does that imply? And just to give a bit of context, or give a few notices before I start. Just a reminder, really, those of you watching this will probably be aware of this, but that all these talks will become available on YouTube, that you can join them to come and join the discussion and ask questions by joining the Middle Way Network, which you can do on the Middle Way Society website, middlewaysociety.org, and that these talks are related to a book, The 5 Principles of the Middle Way, which you can buy from Equinox, the publisher, or at other online bookshops. And finally, that there are also a series of retreats related to these talks and this general theme, which are held at Tirlin House in Wales. Again, so you can find links to that on the Middle Way Society website. Okay, so let's start off with well, what provisionality is, and just a general introduction to what we're going to be talking about for this session and the next one. So this session is called Provisionality 1, Adapting to Conditions. So provisionality generally is basically the ability to think flexibly. It's not a very commonly used word, surprisingly enough. So although people often use the word provisional as an adjective, turning it into a noun, well, when I first started using the term provisionality, I found Microsoft Word kept underlining it because it didn't recognize it. So it's obviously not a widely used term, but it does seem to be an important one to me. So the ability to think flexibly, but particularly in the context of the middle way, not getting stuck in absolute assumptions. And we don't get stuck in absolute assumptions if we have alternative options. So if we have what I call optionality. So optionality is having alternative possibilities available to us. So provisionality is the second of the 5 principles we're talking about in this series, along with skepticism, incrementality, agnosticism, and integration. So it's completely interdependent with those other principles. The last couple of sessions I've been talking about skepticism, recognition of uncertainty, dependent on our embodiment as human beings. So given that we're in this uncertain, limited position, if we face up to that, that's the practice of skepticism, as I see it. But that's not really quite enough by itself. What's the implication once you've faced up to uncertainty? Provisionality is then, applying this to judgment. How do we actually positively judge things? How do we positively think and indeed live as though things are uncertain, as though we were not God, as though we were just human, and as though we were living in an uncertain world? So provisionality follows from skepticism in all sorts of ways. It also interrelates in ways I'll talk more about later in the series with incrementality and agnosticism and integration. But perhaps particularly just at the moment, I could mention the importance of the connection with the last one, integration. Yeah, that our general states of mind and the degree to which we've overcome inner and outer conflicts are all interrelated closely with provisionality. So the more provisional we can be, the less we're going to get hung up on particular beliefs, and the less we're going to get into conflict with either bits of ourselves or others with different beliefs. So there's this close relationship, which I don't think is always appreciated, between thinking in a flexible way and avoiding conflicts and indeed all the bad things that come from conflict. Okay, so in relation to provisionality and the way I'm going to talk about it, well, there's how we can be provisional, and there's also why. So the three S's in the how bit that I'm going to talk about today: suppression, slowness, and synthesis. So broadly, these involve applying attention, keeping that attention going enough over time, doing enough with our attention over time, taking enough time over it, and including a wide enough range of options. That's the synthesis. So I'll come back to these shortly. But the how of provisionality also includes aspects of critical thinking. So when we try to consider more options in more complex judgments, so things like scientific judgments or moral judgments or political issues, say, when we're onto those sorts of things, then there are a lot of complex judgments which making those complex judgments provisional requires a bit more thought about what particularly I talk about as weighing up our judgments. So what it is to make full use of our experience and not make dogmatic assumptions when we judge complex issues. So that will be very much the subject of the second talk following this, Provisionality 2. Yeah, so that's called Provisionality 2, weighing up our judgments. So I won't say that much about that this time, but the two ideas of probabilizing and weighing up are the key ideas there that I'll be talking about in the second talk. Okay, so all of that's involved in the how of provisionality, how we can be provisional, starting with the three S's, moving on later to some of the details of how we deal with complex issues provisionally. But there's also a why. I mean, why be provisional? Why bother with it? But there are all sorts of ways in which provisionality is beneficial, not because you can calculate exactly what good effects it will have, but because it's adaptive, because it allows us to face up to unexpected conditions. So adaptiveness is also a key idea here for understanding provisionality. And I'll be looking at that again to try to frame our motives, to think about why we might be provisional. Okay, so structure of what I'm going to say now is it starts with how provisionality works through optionality, going on to why, that is how provisionality is adaptive, and then look at the basics of how the three S's, suppression, slowness, and synthesis. So that basic how structure will then be developed further in the second talk. Okay, so let me start then with optionality as the first sort of main area I want to talk about here. So optionality, having options, it's a bigger idea than having choices. So it's possibilities we can consider, ways our awareness can interact with possibilities. So if we're thinking about how to overcome absolutization in practice, then provisionality of judgment is key to doing that. And the reason why that's the case is that absolutization restricts options all the time. It focuses only on usually two options. Whereas provisionality, if we can practice it, opens up more options. That's kind of the, if you only stopped at that idea, I think that might be a really good starting point, just to think of considering more options as a beneficial thing to do whenever we're trying to make a judgment about something. So restricting options in absolutization, let's think about that just for a moment. So restricted option is an assumption that usually that there are only two options available. Sometimes it's more so sometimes you can also restrict options when you think there are only three options, but usually it's two in practice. So there are more options. Well, we can discover more options if we expand our experience and attention and so on. But if you restrict the options, which is a long-standing sort of fallacious way of thinking, really, then you block out the awareness that there can be more options. And this also results in what's known as a false dichotomy. So imposing some kind of dualistic framework on our understanding, so there's only two options. Realism versus idealism, for example, philosophically, so either there's a real world or there isn't, that sort of thing. Free will and determinism is another one. Either we're completely responsible for everything we do, or we can't do anything at all of our own will. So those are just quick examples of false dichotomies that are turned into metaphysical beliefs, supposed metaphysical beliefs. So those restrict the options in all sorts of ways. So people apply those kinds of beliefs very often in practice in all sorts of ways. For example, if they're thinking about a criminal and their responsibility, either they're responsible, totally responsible for what they did, or they're not at all responsible. You know, that's the dichotomy being imposed on the way we're thinking about them. So absolutization involves an assumption that only our current beliefs or their negation are available as options. And usually the negation is kind of unthinkable option. It's what the people you don't like and are opposed to believe. So you may have some sort of caricatured view of what the alternative is there, but at least you recognize there's another option. Yeah. So if you're a very deeply committed theist, for example, you will recognize that there's such a thing as atheism. There is a denial of your position. Yeah. But anything other than your belief you have is the unthinkable other, the only other possibility. So if you're thinking absolutely, you restrict your thinking to those two options. And in the process, you don't differentiate between different alternatives to that dominant belief. So there I think of famous speech by George Bush Jr. At the time of just before the Iraq War, I think it was, or maybe after 9/11, where he stood up and said, "If you're not with us, you're with the terrorists." Yeah, so if you're not fully supportive of his anti-terrorist policies, there's no other option. You're an ally of the terrorists. There's no differentiation there between different ways of wanting to oppose terrorism or work against it. So obviously that kind of pattern is reproduced in all sorts of situations, all sorts of groups opposed to other groups, individuals getting stuck in particular sets of dogmatic beliefs opposed to the opposite belief, so on. Okay, so provisionality, if it's a way out of this restriction of the options, is primarily the practice of considering more than two restrictive options. So how do we expand the options? How do we consider more options? Well, particularly applied attention, applying our attention to other possibilities, and imagination. So we've got to be able to imagine those other possibilities. It also requires us to have a critical understanding of the limitations of our view, so that we don't take it absolutely. So that's where the practice of skepticism comes in. But once we've already talked about that in the previous talks, but once you've accepted that uncertainty, you've already seen the limitations that your view might have, then you need to be able to more positively apply attention to thinking about possible alternatives. Another way of thinking about what we're doing when we are expanding the options, trying to be more provisional, is creating weak links. So you can even think about this neurally, that all the connections we make between different meaningful ideas are, in some sense, neural links in our brains and possibly beyond our brains as well. Let's not be too brainist, but weak links within our wider system, particularly our neural system. And it's those weak links that create alternative possibilities. They're weak because we haven't really used them yet so as to strengthen them. We haven't turned them into beliefs. They're just possibilities. They're things we can imagine, consider. So creating weak links can be seen also as the development of imagination. And obviously the arts have a crucial role there. So, so all these possibilities, these new possibilities that we consider, they're made available by recognizing the need to consider them and by paying attention to the alternatives. But of course, all the possibilities we might consider at any given point are not always relevant. Theoretically, there could be a sort of infinite number of possibilities, couldn't there? So if I'm sitting here thinking what to do next, or if I'm considering what to have for dinner or something like this, I'm not going to consider everything. I'm not going to consider completely bizarre ideas like eating Greenland for dinner, or inviting a armadillo or whatever else. Whatever random ideas come into your head, those are not likely. They might be fun for a while, but they're not likely to be very relevant to your thinking. So when we talk about options and possibilities, they do need to be relevant in some sense. They don't always have to be explicitly considered to be relevant, to be made relevant. But a lot of our thinking, in fact, works on the basis of intuitive processes. So intuitive processes contribute to our awareness in a way that's relevant to a particular situation. So perhaps it's easier to think about this if you put yourself in a very concrete situation where something new arises, right? So You, let's say you go outside your house onto the street and you meet a person you haven't met before. How do you size them up before you speak to them? So there's all sorts of intuitive, very quick processes that we go through when we meet a new person who's strange to us, in order to get a sense of them. And we can't possibly go crunch our way through, is this person male or female? Are they old or young? Are they all these different categories we might think about in order to think about how we should respond to them. We don't do any of that in this sort of linear way. We tend to do it intuitively, as a gestalt. We just have a quick sense of who this person is. We take them in, as it were. So I think that's very much the kind of process that occurs when we make any judgment. Yeah, we're in a particular situation, and that situation is framed by a certain sort of relevant range of things we could think about. But within that relevant range, provisionality would lead us to move beyond the restriction of the options to those two absolutes. So it's not requiring us to unrealistically think about everything we could potentially think about, but it is realistically asking us to expand what we consider. Okay, let me move on then. So that's something about optionality and basically how provisionality works as I see it. And then there's the question of why it's helpful. So the adaptiveness of provisionality. Okay, so provisionality is helpful, broadly beneficial to us because it helps us to address new and unexpected conditions. Now, obviously, we can't predict in advance what those conditions will be. That's the whole point, in a way. So that's why we can't say very precisely how provisionality benefits us. We don't know how it's going to do so. All we can say is that when something completely new happens that we're not otherwise prepared for, we need to be able to think in new ways in order to respond effectively to that new situation. So the whole process of taking into account new possibilities is there's a lot of discussion around this. Some of it can get technical and mathematical. So Nassim Nicholas Taleb is an important writer on this theme, who's influenced me in various ways, I think. So all his books really are about this, how we face up to statistically improbable events. Improbable events that nevertheless happen. So it's easy to dismiss events that seem to be, well, improbable, so therefore I don't need to think about them. But unlikely events happen all the time. It's just they don't happen. Well, let's put it this way: if there's a 10% chance of an event occurring, then 90% of the time it won't happen, but 10% of the time it will. So if the weather forecast tells me there's a 10% chance of rain, it may rain. I can't just dismiss the chance of rain. So obviously we can get into even more highly improbable but nevertheless important events. Nassim Nicholas Taleb talks about fat tails statistically as that is events for which there's a low probability, but there's a big impact. So if you think about global catastrophes, obviously, maybe technological or scientific revolutions, like some discussion about AI at the moment, or people unexpectedly losing their confidence in absolute beliefs that they previously had all their lives, or even at personal level, things like unexpected bereavement or illness, things like that. Yeah, so we can get taken by surprise. So all these kinds of situations, particularly, is when provisionality is needed. We can't really prepare for all these eventualities, but we can be provisional enough to adapt to them nevertheless. Without provisionality, our lives are adapted to a set of limited conditions, the ones that we regularly encounter and have thus geared ourselves up to. So for most of us, that's likely to be the kind of conditions we encounter at home, work, maybe in relation to the people we meet regularly, the environment we move in regularly. So they're environmental, social, cultural, political, economic conditions. We're adapted to those conditions, and then even an unexpected recession, economic recession, can throw us sometimes, like it did many people in 2008. So we tend to rely on the stability of the surrounding systems. And again, we suffer, perhaps needlessly, without provisionality if we don't expect those systems to change. And systems change, or can change, quite rapidly when they reach certain tipping points. It's not that they change instantaneously, but that the change reaches a point where lots of things suddenly flip over. And the much discussed example of that is obviously climate change at the moment. So if you think about the impacts, say, of melting ice, reducing the albedo, the effect of the reflection of sunlight back into space. So the more, in other words, the more the ice melts, the more warmth is created. So we get a chain, a snowball effect, as it were, ironically, of further conditions which happen quite suddenly and just accelerate because of those changes. So that's why perhaps things can take us by surprise, despite the principle of incrementality, which I'll talk about in a future talk, which basically says that it's not helpful to think of things as happening instantaneously, but nevertheless, things do happen quite quickly at times. So provisionality allows us to adapt to new conditions, and that's a very obvious relevance in our current situation as regards climate change, and many other things that face us individually or collectively. So provisionality allows us to consider alternative options beyond the assumptions we've absolutized in our current environment, and so that we have more resources available to us when catastrophe does strike. And provisionality in that sense is an aspect of anti-fragility. So anti-fragility is Nassim Nicholas Taleb's coined term, but it's a very useful one, I think. So it's the opposite of being fragile. We're fragile and unexpected conditions can break us easily. If we're anti-fragile, then unexpected new challenging conditions actually make us stronger. So Taleb talks, for example, about building muscles. So muscles are built up by lots of little stresses, and they respond to those stresses by getting stronger. And because of those little stresses, they're then able, obviously, to deal with bigger stresses when they arrive. So in the same way, if you like, the stress of having to think differently, if it is a stress, maybe a joy, but you may think of it as a stress, having to face up to uncertainty and think differently from usual. The more we can do that, I think, the more we build up the capacity to cope with new conditions. So you can think of it as building up the mental muscles as well as the physical ones. Okay, so that's a bit about adaptiveness. Obviously, there's more I could say about that topic, but I'll leave it there so I can focus more for the rest of this talk on how we actually can develop provisionality. So the 3 S's which I mentioned earlier, the remainder of what I'm going to talk about now then. So suppression, slowness, and synthesis. So these are all qualities, if you like, we need to work on in order to become more provisional. So suppression, first of all. Now, people might be surprised by my use of this word if they don't differentiate sufficiently between suppression and repression. But I think the distinction is very important between those 2 terms. So suppression is a positive thing. We need it for provisionality. Repression, on the other hand, is the source of conflict and absolutization. So repression is generally, I think, a very bad thing. How do you tell the difference? Well, suppression basically is a directing of our attention. Yeah, we need, in order to direct our attention, we have to cut some things out, as well as decide how to focus our attention. We can't focus our attention on everything all at once. We're not God. So suppression is necessary for embodied creatures. But in the process, we don't have to lose our capability to think about the things that we've decided for the moment not to think about. So suppression is putting things aside, whereas repression is trying to get rid of them. So the capacity for suppression is like a major condition for provisionality, I think, because we can't extend our attention to new possibilities unless we're sufficiently focused, unless we focus our attention first. And if we're going to focus our attention, that's got a positive and a negative side. We have to cut out what's not relevant in the current situation. So some people have remarked that there's a crisis of attention in the modern world, which is very much the effect of mobile phones, particularly, maybe some other devices as well. But the impact of mobile phones on many people's attention seems to have created a major crisis, because they tend to undermine people's capacity for basic suppression. So to engage in a conversation undistracted, for instance, if people are constantly have half a mind on their phone, what their phone might, the new notifications they might get on it or whatever, they're not really engaging in the conversation. So yeah, this is something you can practically see in every restaurant, unfortunately. So yeah, what's needed there is suppression. You need to say, well, actually, I'm not going to look at my phone right now. Phone goes over there, it maybe goes off, and focus on the conversation. Obvious, but for some reason, obviously, we have difficulty doing that, or many of us have difficulty doing that. So that's an illustration of suppression and why it's important. But in that process, we don't have to cut out what's not relevant in an absolute way. If we're repressing, then we're trying to eliminate options. Whereas if we're suppressing, we make more options available, in fact, because we're able to focus our attention on them. So suppression of what's not relevant is required in order to focus within the realm of what's relevant on a wider range of possibilities. And this has a link to the practice of agnosticism as well, I think, which obviously I'll expand on in future talks in this series. So the practice of agnosticism involves avoiding the allure of absolute beliefs on both sides. And that can be seen as an aspect of suppression. We don't try to eliminate absolutes. This is the crucial aspect of the middle way. We're not trying to get rid of absolutes, because if we do that, we just end up with the opposite absolute. So that's a mistake people so often make. They recognize something absolute, don't agree with that, go straight to the opposite position, which is still absolute. So they haven't got rid of the absolutization. So that's what repression tends to do. You try and push it away, you try and get rid of it, and in the process you create the opposite, which is just as absolute as the thing you pushed away. So agnosticism, awareness of the third alternative, goes along with suppression, but it's incompatible with repression. So there's a kind of sidestepping going on, even on everyday judgment, and that continues to be kind of applied at a more sort of philosophical level, if you like, when we try and practice agnosticism. Okay, so that's suppression, the first of the three S's, which I think is involved in provisionality. The second one, though, is slowness. So quite often, to be provisional, we need to slow down in some respect. Basic reason for that is that we need enough time if we're going to consider new options. We can't consider unfamiliar options all at once. We have to be able to get a sense of them meaningfully, perhaps explore their implications. So yeah, we obviously, if we're hasty, we don't think, we don't consider enough. So hence the value of slowing down whenever possible, which means taking enough time to consider more than just the absolutized options, expanding to that third or fourth or whatever option. So that's the flip side, really, of absolutizations being shortcuts. So absolutizations are always tempting because they save time and energy. It's much easier just to choose the right thing, which you absolutely believe to be right. Reject the thing we think is wrong, and that's it. We don't have to think about it anymore. We've made our decision, then we can get on with it, as it were. Provisionality is a bit more complicated, so it takes a bit more time, a bit more energy, but it's worth it in the longer term, of course. And we get better at it, and it's less of a drain of time and energy the more we do it. So also we become more efficient at it through practice. So things like meditation, reflection, expansive discussion, maybe with others, almost any kind of recreation, well, most kinds of recreation, they can all help you slow things down a bit. Yeah, so even if it's just going for a walk, that gives us sense of space to consider new options rather than just taking the shortcut. However, obviously slowness has its limitations. It's not always appropriate to be slow. Some conditions demand decisiveness and speed. If you're driving a car and you're in a dangerous situation, then you've got to react so as to avoid an accident quickly. You can't do it better by slowing down necessarily, although slowing down might be one of the options you need to consider. But yeah, there are also classic situations like, there's a drowning child in the pond. Are you just going to sit there thinking about what to do, or are you going to save them? So some conditions certainly demand decisiveness and speed. Provisionality isn't a reason for not meeting those conditions. Yeah, so provisionality isn't to be confused with indecisiveness, I think, and that's because decisive. There's such a thing, I think, as decisive provisionality. So that is, we consider the range of options that are relevant within the time available to us, and we weigh them up as much as feasible. But indecisiveness, on the other hand, usually involves flipping between opposed options. Yeah, so and quite often that takes us back to the absolutization of the options. Yes, should I do this or should I do that? You just can't decide. So actually, you waste a lot more time being indecisive. So provisionality doesn't require us to be indecisive at all, and sometimes very decisive action is needed. But when we do those rapid responses, like saving the drowning child or whatever, usually that's as a result of prior slower practice. So you'd be ill-advised to jump in to save the drowning child if you haven't learned to swim beforehand, and it probably took you a while to learn to swim. It was a slow process. Rapid intuitive judgments usually made much more effective by slow practice first. I get reminded of that all the time because I'm a pianist. So every time I try and play a piece too fast without having played it enough slowly, then I start messing it up. So there's a requirement for slowness, as it were, in the longer term to build up effective rapid action. And that's also related to, I think, the difference between slow calculation, going through things more bit by bit, and rapid intuitive judgment. Another great example that Daniel Kahneman, the cognitive psychologist, uses is the firefighters judging the safety of a burning building. So if they're experienced firefighters and they go in the building and they hear certain things, something about the atmosphere, they just know this is really dangerous, you've got to get out now. But they know that rapidly because of their prior experience of burning buildings. They've built that up over a period of time. Slowness, in a way, is an aspect of provisionality, and it also shows really how provisionality is important in building up effective responses to anything, even quick responses. Okay, so suppression, slowness, and then the third S is synthesis. So provisionality is synthetic in the sense that it links things together. It considers meaningful options and it makes links between those options. And so, the more options we consider, the more we're creating links. We're using our imagination and strengthening that imagination. So synthesis can occur at both meaning level and belief level. So at the level of meaning, we're linking together ideas or concepts or meaningful symbols or whatever. And that's a development of imagination. But at the belief level, we're developing wider coherent theories. We can integrate our meaning and we can integrate our beliefs by making more connections of that kind. So yeah, provisionality involves both of those kinds of synthesis, I think. Yeah, so it's both just making links between ideas and also developing more coherent beliefs about things. One of the things that blocks synthesis or stands in the way of synthesis in the modern world can be over-specialization. So our lives tend to lead us into specialization in all sorts of ways. Perhaps the most basic one of those is gender roles. If you sort of specialize in being a man or a woman, or if you're in a particular set of cultural traditions, like say a religious tradition, and you specialize in being a Christian, say, or being a Presbyterian or whatever it is. Or of course, there's professional specialization, being an expert on mosses, or scientist, or being a proficient tree surgeon or whatever. Yeah. And then of course there's academic specialization, which may also be professional, but we may study a particular area. So there's all kinds of specializations we may be led into, which basically specialization of any kind helps us deal with particular conditions more effectively. We get to engage with those particular conditions in more and more detail. We make lots of links within the area. But at the same time, specialization restricts our ability to make links beyond that area, and thus we actually become less prepared for things new conditions that require us to move beyond that area. And that's well, people also talk about comfort zones, don't they? And reaching beyond your comfort zone. So obviously provisionality involves that, reaching beyond our comfort zone, or reaching beyond the ways we've previously specialized to whatever degree, in whatever way. And making new connections, basically, beyond that. So I think over-specialization is a major problem of modern life, because our complex social and economic systems and so on often depend on specialization to create certain efficiencies. But at the same time, those efficiencies restrict our adaptiveness as individuals. And that also has an effect on us collectively as well. And also over-specialization can lead to an overemphasis on analysis as an end in itself. Now, analysis is working out what's involved in a particular set of beliefs, say, is incredibly useful skill, but it's only ever as useful as the synthesis it starts with. So you can't break things apart until you've put them together sufficiently to do so. So yeah, analysis goes together with synthesis, but I think synthesis is the prior process, the more basic process. So provisionality, very much involves synthesis, I think, and it's likely to mean reaching beyond whatever specializations you've engaged with so far, in order to try and connect with new conditions. Okay, let me wrap up then this talk. So those are the three S's. So synthesis, suppression, slowness, obviously need to be applied together. So there's, for example, there's no point applying slowness without synthesis. So you can, if you're just slow, you could think in a very narrow, limited way, slowly as well as quickly. And there's no merit just in being slow. You also need to be synthetic and to suppress. So and then there are obviously things you can slide into just by taking any of those three S's in isolation. So suppression could easily slip into repression, and slowness can turn into lack of energy. Stasis and synthesis can turn into superficiality if you try and do too much. So yes, you also lose a certain efficiency if you don't sort of use the synthesis in a relevant way in relation to your life. So those 3 S's, as I've already said, I'll expand on in other ways in the next talk. So when it comes to more complex issues, we also need what I call probabilizing and weighing up, which allow us to put that general approach, those 3 S's, into practice with more complex issues. But generally, the 3 S's help us to make more options available, and they do so both in terms of meaning, connecting things together imaginatively, and in terms of belief. So it improves the imaginative resources available to us and helps us develop more appropriate beliefs about the world in relation to our experience. And a whole range of practices can generally support the 3 S's. And again, that's something I'll expand on later in this series. But quick suggestion for 3 key practices I often talk about: meditation, the arts, critical thinking. See, there are many other helpful practices, but those are, off the top of one's head, those are 3 ones to think about, which exemplify slightly different ways of working, which are interconnected and mutually beneficial. Yeah. So all of those, I think, in different ways can help us with the 3 S's. Yeah. So they can, attention, they can stimulate our imagination for the synthesis bit, they can make us slow down and pay attention to certain things. Okay, so I'd better stop there for now and open up to questions. Any comments? Hi, George.
No, thanks, Robert. I was just wondering about the idea of provisionality, and if you see provisionality as largely linear as a process, as opposed to kind of intuitive, which you kind of talked a little bit about those 2 dynamics, I think.
Yeah, I don't think I see it as linear particularly. Is there anything that gave you the impression I thought of it as linear?
Well, just when you're slowing down and having to think things through, it tends to be a process that you go through, which will often be a kind of linear process, or at least be based on that to some strong degree, I would have thought, whereas the other process is much more decided on the spot because of previous knowledge that you've got or experience. So that's why I was wondering about that aspect of it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's where there's the tension between the slow and the fast, isn't there? And I mean, I guess, yeah, you could describe a process of judgment as linear. But on the other hand, the more effective that judgment is, in a way, the less linear it is, because the more you're taking into account in that judgment process. So I guess what makes us linear is often that we have to sort of consider a situation and then make a judgment about it and then act. So that's a kind of line, isn't it? You start with conditions and you work through to action. But in that process, we can be more or less confined by that linearity, perhaps. So I'd see provisionality as an aspect of not being too confined by linearity and taking the complexity of systems more into account. Yeah. Yeah, all the stuff in Nassim Nicholas Taleb and the fat tails and all that, and the adaptivity is very much about facing up to systems and the complexity of systems, really, because that creates so much uncertainty in relation to our experience. Yeah, so that takes us beyond linearity. On the other hand, we have to take into account that we start with linearity in certain ways.
Just something that might follow on from that. You said at one point, in terms of a link to agnosticism, you said avoid the allure of the extremes, but without trying to get rid of absolutes themselves. I wondered if you might say a little bit more about what your attitude towards absolutes is then. You're not trying to get rid of them in your thinking, you just put them aside completely.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I think that's distinctively the way to handle absolutes or absolute beliefs. That is that you have to put them aside and recognize that in a certain sense they're indestructible in their own terms. So therefore you can't eliminate them. So that's what the special skill involved in agnosticism, I think, is sort of, it's a bit like, well, actually, the Buddha used this metaphor of handling a snake, didn't he? If you pick up the snake by the wrong bit, then it will turn around and bite you. Whereas if you handle the snake in the right way, then it can't do that. So you could see the agnosticism being allied with provisionality, and yes, suppressing absolutes in the sense of letting go of them but not trying to eliminate them, and finding that balance between not allowing them to take over your attention, sidestepping them if you like, without trying to destroy them, which is what will suck you into an absolute way of thinking, once again, as you get into a polarized relationship with it. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah, thank you.
Any other thoughts? Okay, well, I could go on then to say a little bit about the practice focused questions. Yeah, so as usual, these are just reflections which may or may not be helpful to try and personalize this a bit more, to connect it to your own experience. And as usual, the notes on this will be available when I put them in the Slack area. Okay, so 4 questions here. So the first question, what's your experience of encountering new situations where the assumptions need to be different? So you might want to think here about, what times in the past have you experienced having to face up to new situations which challenge your assumptions? Traveling is an obvious example, where most people face up to this or encounter this, particularly traveling somewhere that's very, very different or very strange. Or traveling when you haven't had the experience of traveling before. Could also be other kinds of traveling, as it were, maybe meeting people in another custom sphere, or putting yourself in a very different environment, maybe a very wild environment. So yeah, and if you go on a voyage to Antarctica, then there won't be a lot of cultural challenges, but there'll be a lot of environmental ones, for instance. Yeah, the assumptions may need to be different in those situations. So I think it's worth just reflecting on how that was. You know, if you want to think about provisionality and how did you adapt, you know, and that might also give you confidence in your capacity for provisionality. Okay, second question. What kinds of practices do you think can or have helped you to be provisional in such situations? So, for example, if you've practiced the arts, do you think that's made a difference to your imaginative response? Has that made you more adaptable in some ways? Or if you practice meditation, has that enabled you to open and focus your attention on new possibilities? You know, that might particularly in communication, might be helpful in being aware of other people's perspectives. Okay, so connecting your reflections on those new situations with practices also that you've experienced. And then 3, now I've already mentioned climate change as, you know, just the one big reason why this is all relevant to all of us, particularly at the moment, even though it's always been relevant. But so the question number 3 is, what are your reflections on our preparedness for climate change? Both at a socio-political and an individual level. So there are obviously huge challenges there, I think. You know, and so many ways in which individuals obviously have difficulty facing up to the prospect of major climate change and its effects, and adapting themselves to it. Okay, and 4th question. What are the conditions that most help you to apply the 3 S's? So trying to think a bit more specifically about the conditions for provisionality. So if we think about those 3 S's, suppression, slowness, and synthesis, what most helps you to develop each of those? So you might there think with question 4, there's a 4A, a 4B, and a 4C. So what helps you develop suppression, appropriate attention, if you like, and a relevant attention in a particular circumstance? What helps you to slow down? And what helps you to synthesize? Okay. So I think I will stop the recording there.